Okay, great. Well, looks like folks are still trickling in, but the deluge has slowed. So welcome everyone. My name is Caitlin Cusack. I am a forester with the Vermont Land Trust. And thanks for joining us today for an exciting and presentation that will focus on old growth and old forests. We're joined today by two wonderful folks, colleagues who have a great depth of knowledge in this area. Liz Thompson, who you all may know, is an ecologist at the Vermont Land Trust. She's the director of conservation science and author of Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, textbook for many of us. And David McMath, who is a forester with the Vermont Land Trust, spent a couple decades before coming to work with us at VLT as a consulting forester, who also managed the Atlas lands, which was a joint ownership by the Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy. So just a couple of quick, oh, please turn my volume up. Thanks, Lark. Is that better? No. Okay. Okay. Well, I'll try and keep it. Okay. So someone says it sounds okay. So we're going to go with it. And Lark, possibly trying to adjust the volume on your computer. See if that works. So just a couple. I know everyone by this point is pretty familiar with Zoom, but just a couple things. Liz and David are gonna wait till the end to take questions. But if you happen to run into any trouble, like as you all are doing here, just enter the comment in the chat box, and myself and Catherine Hancock, who's also providing some tech support today, can get back to you. If you have any questions, I'd ask that you would use the Q&A. So at the bottom of your screen, far right, you'll see a Q&A box. If you click on that and you enter your question, then Liz and David, we can get to them at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Liz and enjoy the show.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. It's great to have everyone here today. Really love this topic, and I know many of you do too. It's wonderful to be able to talk about it. Really pleased to be doing this with my colleague, David McMath. We both love old forests and have a lot of passion for the topic. So we're going to talk about the way we're going to do this is we're going to talk about what old growth forests are and what old forests are and how we distinguish between those two concepts. We're going to talk about why they're important and why we need them on the landscape. And then we're going to take a virtual tour of some sites in Vermont, mostly Vermont sites, but a couple of places outside of Vermont and some places actually in other parts of the world briefly, to see just some examples of what some old forests look like. So with that, we're going to start here with a definition. And I'll start by saying, ask any ecologist and you'll get a different definition than the ecologist you asked yesterday. Lots of different people have different definitions of what old growth is. It's a kind of a confusing term, but a couple of people that I've talked to, one is Charlie Cogbill. He just sees it as the continuity of process over time, just plain time. And David Foster talks about 3 to 4 centuries without human intervention. That's how long it takes to get the complexity that we see in old growth forests. So long periods of time. And Bob Leverett, who is a old forest guru, who's done a lot of work in Massachusetts and elsewhere and in the South, he says, and that is whether or not the forest has experienced catastrophic disturbance and whether or not the trees in it now are old. It doesn't matter if the trees are old, and it doesn't matter if there's been catastrophic disturbance. If a place has been untouched by humans for a long time, it's still considered an old growth forest. Other terms that you have heard, probably primary forest, meaning the first forest that was here, original forest, virgin forest, which means completely untouched by humans. I don't think we have any such thing in the Northeast. The forest primeval, ancient forest, and ancient woodland. And those are terms that are used more in Europe, ancient woodland, for example. And some old growth forests, but not all, have some of these characteristics or attributes. Often there's trees of many ages, often some very large old trees. There are canopy gaps, down wood in all stages of decay, robust mycorrhizal networks, standing deadwood, tip-up mounds, and seeming disarray. They're messy places. So just to illustrate some of these concepts, trees of many ages, some very large old trees, that's about a 6-inch long pencil for scale on this yellow birch. Canopy gaps, because in the Northeast, a single tree fall and canopy gap dynamics is the primary disturbance regime in these forests. And so we get single trees dying and leaving canopy gaps, which brings regeneration and diversity into the forest. Down wood in all stages of decay. Here's David.
So we have a wonderful example of a nurse log coarse woody material here, very large. It's probably been here a very long time because cedar takes so long to decompose. And it's spongy, you know, it's moist feeling, got a lot of the mosses. Again, we've got white cedar, we've got a spruce, we've got balsam fir. And what's interesting here, we have a yellow birch root that comes all the way back up to this small clump of yellow birch here. And again, it's just feeding on, we have a beautiful large cedar beyond it.
Great. So that was a video that was taken in a site that you'll hear about in a few minutes. So the other thing about old forests is they have these vast and well-developed mycorrhizal networks. Mycorrhizae is a word that is a combined word. Myco means fungus and rhiza means root. So root with fungus and root. And this is a symbiotic relationship between the fungi and the roots of plants, trees and other plants in the forest. It's an amazing thing that has really only been known about for a few decades. And just in the past 10 years, there's just an incredible amount of research that's been going on to learn more about these networks and how they work. And it's been found that the trees, so it's the symbiosis is the trees feed sugar and carbon to the fungi, and the fungi in turn gather up nutrients from the soil and send those up through the roots up to the trees and other plants in the forest. So it's an amazing connection, and also through these connections, trees can actually share nutrients with one another, and they can even share to some extent chemically information. So for example, if there's a insect attack on one tree, the chemical compounds that might produce could be shared through the fungal network to another tree. So but this is all new research. It's mostly gone on in the Pacific Northwest, so we don't really know as much about it in the Northeast as in the Pacific Northwest. But a researcher named Suzanne Simard has done a lot of this work, and it's just fascinating stuff. Okay, so there's often standing deadwood in these forests, which provides all kinds of habitat for woodpeckers and other things. Tip-up mounds, which again creates mounds of soil and really interesting habitat for things like winter wren, which might nest on one of these. This is a poor photo because it was very bright that day, but you can see the huge tip-up mound next to my friend Victoria, who's about 5 feet tall. And they have seeming disarray. Thoreau described the woods of Maine as mossy and moosey, and we could also say they're messy. These are messy places, and that's part of the charm of them.
So, Liz has been going through sort of what, a true old growth is, but unfortunately we don't have much of that left. I read that it's basically, old growth was the predominant natural condition in New England before, obviously, European settlement, but now it's really the rarest. We have less than 0.1% of our forest cover is now considered, true old growth. And in fact, some ecologists will argue that there is no such thing as true old growth. So unfortunately, we can't create new old growth that's given. So, what can we do? And I think that's where this term of old forest comes in. And so it's basically in these stands, and I know the other foresters in the audience have been there. You walk into a stand that just has a different feel. So it needs to have trees that are at least 150 years old and can have characteristics of some of those characteristics that Liz mentioned. I like the UVA definition. That's our current use program in Vermont. The forests, our forests have to have trees that are biologically mature. We've had, minimal human activity. So I think of like on some of the Atlas lands where the forests never, they've been worked over the years, but they never went through that clearing that happened during the agricultural times when the sheep were really prominent. Haven't had any major stand disturbance beyond that. They're showing multiple age classes. So again, a lot of our forests in New England, at least in Vermont, are even aged or two age. These would have multiple age classes. And again, back to that older forest component. So I threw this next slide in. I know through most of my education, we're always looking, especially at forestry, we're always looking at growth and yield. We never really focused on how old you can grow a tree. And I was kind of stunned by some of this. We have balsam fir, for example. If I found a 100-year-old balsam fir, that was old growth, but they can go 200 plus years. A red pine at 500 years old. But the real stunner for me was a northern white cedar, over 1,000 years old. So it just kind of gets you thinking differently. So I think the rest of our talk and stuff, and certainly a tour, will be really looking at old forests, not necessarily true old growth.
So why do we need old forests? And so, as David said, we're going to use the more general term old forest. Old growth forests were, as David said, the predominant land cover in our region prior to European settlement. They provide ideal habitat for many species, and their complexity creates diversity. I'm going to go through each of these things one by one. So this is the Harvard Forest dioramas. I know there are a couple of people from Harvard Forest here, and this is an amazing collection of dioramas at the Fisher Museum at Harvard Forest. If you've never been there, you should go. I believe they're closed right now because of COVID, but when things reopen, really worth going. So these dioramas illustrate a place. These first few of the dioramas illustrate a place just as the settlers found it and then as they settled. So this is the same location here with clearing and settling of the land. And there you can see the hillsides are all bare. And in New England, and particularly in Vermont, the merino sheep was a really important factor in this. There was, starting in the early 1800s, there was this guy, William Jarvis, who went to Spain and brought back to North America like 15,000 of these merino sheep. And they didn't want to export them, but he sort of, when there was chaos over there in Spain, he took advantage of that and brought a bunch of these sheep back over. And this was a real craze in Vermont, that people started raising these sheep and making a lot of money from the excellent wool that they yielded. So this really cleared the land. And by the end of this time, Vermont was 80% open land, only 20% forest, when it had started at about 95% forest. But now that ended, farming moved west, and now the forest is regrowing. And here again is that same location with an artist drawing it or painting it. So the forest is now coming back. And in Vermont, we're now at about 75% forest. Here's a diagram from the Wildlands and Woodlands publication that shows this, here's Vermont, right about 1870 was the maximum clearing of the land. Now, here's another reason that we need old forests. They provide ideal habitat for many species like Blackburnian warbler, barred owls, certain lichens and mosses, and some mammals like bear, marten, among others. This is a Blackburnian warbler. There was a study in Pennsylvania that compared old forests and younger forests and found that Blackburnian warblers were 45 times more abundant in old forests, and a bunch of other birds were more abundant in old forests too. And some people have said that the demise of the passenger pigeon may have resulted from the loss of old growth forests. Certain lichens are really, more common in old forests. This is the lung lichen, Loberia. This is a Necora moss that tends to be more common in old forest. And there's both of them on a tree. And here's beautiful Necora moss on a tree in Eric Sorensen's black ash swamp. Well, for another reason, the complexity of old forests creates a diversity of habitats, which results in greater biological diversity. And this sort of is common sense, that the more diverse the habitat, the more species rich it'll be. And there's a study, Tony D'Amato, Dave Orwig, and David Foster did some studies in Massachusetts forests comparing old growth forest to younger forest, and found that in the older forest, the ground cover was 4 times as much, species richness was twice as high, greater overall diversity. In hobblebush, you think of this as a very common plant, but that was one of the ones in these older forests in Massachusetts that's associated with old forests. Here's another story. This is a study. This is a European study showing the number of species of animals, plants, and fungi as they change over time. And you can see the lowest for plants and animals is in this middle stage. 3 more reasons. With their deep duff layers and abundant downwood, old forests may serve better than younger forests to provide hydrological regulation. And there's a lot of work on this, a lot of research on this. Wood falling in streams creates complex habitats in the streams and actually increases diversity in stream systems. Also cleans water, provides flood resilience in times of high water. And the dynamic nature of old forests can provide protection for regeneration. And this is really interesting. And there was a story from Pennsylvania. This picture is not from Pennsylvania, but in the Tionesta forest there in 1985, there was a tornado that knocked down a lot of big old trees in an old growth forest area, and they were not salvaged, they were left there. But when that happened, and a couple of different people have told me this story, the regeneration was fantastic. In Pennsylvania, the forests are devastated by deer, by white-tailed deer, browsing all the regeneration. And when this disturbance happened, the regeneration was just astounding. So I'm going to turn it over now to David to talk about carbon.
Well, we can't get through a talk without talking about carbon these days. So, looking at the role our forests can play in climate change mitigation, forest carbon has become really, really important component, and specifically that carbon storage. So the bottom line is older forests are storing more carbon than younger ones. It turns out that big old trees are carbon storing champions. It's pretty amazing. But looking a little bit closer at our sort of a holistic view of the forest, is that it's not just being stored in the trees. So you can bump to the next one, Liz, if you want. So we have, well, they call it carbon pools, but when you're looking at the overall forest, so about half of it is stored in the living biomass. So that would be A and B. That'd be the tree, the live tree, and the roots. But then we have the snags, we have the coarse woody material, leaf litter, branches, those kind of things. And then finally, the soil and the organic matter. That sort of makes up the other half. And then just a couple of terms which I think are really important that that I found that are often used interchangeably, but they're quite different. Is we have this carbon sequestration and carbon storage. So the carbon storage obviously is the tree, what's being stored there. But then we have this other thing, carbon sequestration, which is really that chemical process going on, where we're pulling the carbon out, photosynthesis, and all that's going on up in the leaf. And that's what's keeping the tree alive. So go to the next slide, please. So why that is important is when we look at this, at the forest, this graph I really like. So think of it as a clock, obviously 12 o'clock, and then going clockwise, that's the age of the forest. So as you can see, as the forest gets in probably that 20 to 70-year-old range, which is pretty much our lifetime, that's sequestering a lot of carbon. And then as that gets older, we get into that 150-year-old and older, that we get more storage going on than sequestration. Obviously, sequestration has to go on or that tree would die. And so you can see that this older forest is just really starting to ramp up the storage. And again, just reinforcing that they're maximizing that storage. And this, all this is leading to, we're trying to build a more resilient forest. And it just found that a lot of the studies now are pointing towards these, the forests that have these characteristics we've been talking about can really weather things. So again, just, briefly on the climate change, we have all these things. We have the complexity, the diversity of microhabitats, the diversity of species, lots of carbon. So we have these old trees. We have intact aquatic systems that are all part of this. And these can clearly are what going to help our forest become more resilient and ward off some of these effects of climate change. You can bump ahead, Liz. You can go one more, yeah. And so, it's just, when you compare to the younger forests, or these older forests do a lot better. And let's see. So this slide here, just kind of trying to show some of that complexity we have. And just to put a plug, you can bump the next one. Just to put a plug in for research. It's just, we really, I think it's critical that we keep our existing sites intact. We encourage more sites to come online. We have some great research going on, and we need to continue that. I mean, even here in Vermont, we have, Bill Keaton's pretty much his life work has been on old growth. Tony D'Amato, folks like that. And, I think for me, as a sort of coming from a field forester position, we need this research, because we obviously, taking a passive approach is one way. But a lot of our properties, we've family-owned properties, especially throughout Vermont, and these are areas that I think we can have a big impact. So if we can just, modify some of our traditional silvicultural methods to build in some more of these characteristics, I think we'll be better off in the end. So I think with that, we will start on our virtual tour. Oops, we have one more.
That's good.
Sorry, Liz.
Definitely not least. It's really important to say that old forests inspire awe and a sense of wonder. And this is not insignificant. This is really important. They can also, there's research that shows that being in old forest can actually make you feel better, lower your blood pressure, things like that. Barbara Kingsolver said, people need wild places. We need to be able to taste grace and know once again that we desire it. I love that idea. So we'll end there, and then as David said, we'll go on our little tour. We're just going to take a tour around Vermont, and I chose this map of Vermont towns that says New York patents because New York, at one time, New York thought they owned Vermont. Vermont was part of New York, part of New Hampshire. It was a long history there. But anyway, I like this map. So each star is a place that we're going to go to. And when you see the red star, that's where we're going next. So starting in Marshfield, this is Lord's Hill Natural Area, which is owned by the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. And the fellow in the picture is Jared Nunnery, who's the county forester of Orleans County, and has done a lot of research on old growth forests, very knowledgeable about them. So there's big trees there, there's downwood. It's just a fabulous site. And this is a small area. I think it's maybe 16 acres or something like that, a very small area. And it probably has had some history of sugaring sometime way in the past, but it's one of our iconic, what we do call old growth forests. And these first three sites are going to be those sort of iconic ones. The next one in the town of Killington, which used to be known as Sherburne, we have Gifford Woods State Park. Now you'll see this little asterisk down here. Whenever you see an asterisk by the name of the site, that means that's one that you can go and visit. And so this is one that is eminently visitable. You can actually see some of the old forest characteristics right from your car. You don't even have to get out of your car. But it's a beautiful site, and it has an interesting history of research. This one also had here's a beautiful big hemlock there, sugar maple, and it does have a history of some sugaring in the past. It also has a road going right through the middle of it. It has campsites, an interpretive trail. So it's nothing particularly pristine, but it's really beautiful and has a lot of the attributes of old forest, down wood, standing dead wood. And finally, one of the things that we talk about in forests, which is an unhappy subject, I mentioned it a minute ago in Pennsylvania, in this forest, in Gifford Woods, deer browse is a problem. So regeneration is a problem because there are too many deer, and there's the evidence of it. Okay, now we're going to go to Goshen and to the Cape Research Natural Area in Green Mountain National Forest. This is this is our largest known northern hardwood forest, old growth forest in Vermont. And at the bottom of the slope, there is evidence of human disturbance, but when you get toward the top, it's really quite an amazing forest. And these photos are thanks to Charlie Cogbill. Very, very steep, and that's probably why it was left alone. And it's enriched. It's a rich northern hardwood forest. And this is actually a slide that I took back when I was using film camera, and so I just took a little picture of it. But all kinds of down and snags and so forth. But this one is interesting. If you look in this photo, you can see that there's actually a piece of barbed wire going through this tree. And this is lower down on the slope. So evidence of human activity there. But this is really exciting. In Chittenden, this site, so here's the Cape and here's Gifford Woods. Well, those are two sort of endpoints. And in between those two endpoints, Aaron Marcus, who works for the Natural Heritage Program and also works as a contractor for the Green Mountain National Forest, has been discovering lots and lots of very mature, very old forest in the town of Chittenden. I say old growth here, but he doesn't actually know the history of it. That's very hard to discern. But they are trying to figure that out and really emphasizing the attributes, the characteristics of these old forests. So this is really exciting new work. Lots of acreage of old forest, both rich northern hardwood forest with sugar maple and montane yellow birch, red spruce with mountain wood fern here on the forest floor. Okay, Middlebury, we've already shown this site briefly, but this is the Battelle Biological Preserve, Middlebury College. You can visit this site. Just go to the Abbey Brook Trail and hike up from there, and you'll see some of this. So this is the research site we were showing you before. Greensboro, how about you, David?
Yeah, so jumping up to Greensboro, this is a 300-acre plus property that actually Vermont Land Trust owns. I happen to be the forester on the land before it was sold. Thankfully, the previous landowner was very light touch. So there's a lot going on in this forest, but one of the really unique aspects is what we call mud pond. And there is a property line in there roughly, so we don't own all of mud pond, but the side that we do own. And it's just a wonderful example of cedar swamp. And I'm always curious, I think after taking one of Tom Wessel's classes is trying to figure out, what happened and what was going on. And I think in this case, the nearest farm is quite far away. And it's a downhill to get to it, and it's kind of surrounded, you can see by the topography. It was just a difficult stand to get to. You can see a little bit of harvesting had gone on. Actually, I had picked away at the edges of it during a small harvest, kind of before I knew how unique it was. And also, the previous owner, he owned it during probably when cabin logs for cedar log homes was kind of coming online, which definitely a lot of cedar swamps got cut off when that market opened up. And so he didn't choose to capitalize on it. There's a mill down in Greensboro Bend, not very far away. But anyway, this property is now under the direction of Dan Kilborn, one of our other foresters. It's pretty much a demonstration site at this point. So there is active and passive management going on. And the cedar swamp, we're going to pretty much leave alone. You can bump the next slide, Liz, if you want. I think some of the unique dynamic I find on this one is, this is a deer yard, an active deer yard. And so the question is, how do you keep a stand going when you have deer coming through and eating all the regeneration? And so it's just the last couple of years we've started to see some come up, and it's again lots of questions for me. Is that milder winters? Is that happening and some of this can get up, or is it just we had a lot of snow and they couldn't find them? So this will be a fun one to watch. This one in particular has a lot of dead and down. It's got very thick woods, very high stocking, and it'd be really fun to probably age some of these at some point. So then bumping up from the cedar, we also have some really kind of unique hardwood areas too. And yeah, actually a couple more slides there.
More slides, the cedar.
Yeah, sorry.
There's the Necora moss that I talked about a little bit earlier.
Kind of neat.
And there's the video that you were in.
The famous coarse woody material. So jumping up, when Dan was working up in the hardwood, so there's some, sort of your typical hardwood, and then there's some areas of really nice enrichment. There's an area that probably gotten passed over for whatever reason, and so under current use you can set aside a little bit, and so that's an area that he set aside that we're going to watch. It'd be a nice comparison site for other stuff going on, but it has some beautiful big old trees. Now, of course, we've cut a lot of the nice big trees, so a lot of these big old ones have defect or whatever, and that's why they were left.
What do you suppose is in that cavity, David?
Yeah, you see, I wasn't sticking my head too far in there. A lot of porcupine up in there, a little bit of raccoon moving in now, but, and then let's see. So go back to
I think we're back to
Richford, right? Up there.
Richford.
Yeah, so let's jump up by the Canadian border. This, kind of talking about this mostly because This is part of the old Atlas land. So real quick, that was a very large ownership across the state. They had multiple sawmills, and they were basically a veneer mill. Actually went after big spruce, big beech, big yellow birch, and into the maple a little bit. This is on the spine of the Green Mountains, so it's a lot of steep land also. But I guess my point is, across some of these ownerships, and I found it even on smaller ones, you'll have these areas that were difficult to get to, that didn't get cut, and you'll find some big trees. And I think what I like is when I find those areas, is these are areas that maybe you could consider to manage for old growth characteristics. And Atlas has a lot of this, and this was one of the examples. We found a small area, just a gorgeous big sugar maple. So even on lands, like in this case, that have a long history of harvesting, you still find these small pockets, and I think just are really important to, these are again places you should maybe consider doing some modified silviculture to get some of that old growth characteristics in. Another example of a nice piece of coarse woody debris, and I think the next slide, yeah. So on top of this classic nurse log, we had these yellow birch coming in, and again, just a great example. Back to you, Liz.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so now we'll move on to Barnard. We're jumping around, and there's logic in this, but it might not be clear right away. But in Barnard, there is a site that is a property that we have conserved, and it has a forever wild easement on it. So the landowner's intention was to leave it, as an old forest to become older over time. It's not an old growth forest, but it has some very large trees attaining a lot of the characteristics of old forest. This was a photo that I took last February when we were planning, David and I were planning to actually lead a field trip into this site at a May event that we had planned, and then everything happened, and so we didn't get to do that in person. But that's why we're doing it this way today. But it's a beautiful, beautiful site. So there's hemlock, there's lots of beautiful large sugar maple. That's Acer the dog there with David.
Famous dog.
Standing dead trees. This is a beautiful canopy gap in that forest. Again, this is my friend Victoria, who's 5'2" or something like that. This site has so many different fungi. This was one of the things that really struck us with Victoria and I when we visited, so many different fungi. And this is part of that process of all these different mosses, liverworts, and lichens and fungi are doing the work of breaking down the wood and putting it back into the soil over time. So this is a slime mold. There's some lichens in this photo. That's I think, a honey mushroom, and all kinds of different, these are spent puffballs. So all kinds of different fungi and mosses and liverworts and so forth in this beautiful, beautiful forest. It just came alive to us as a place of fantastic fungi. Now to Granville. This is a place I visited very recently with Bob Zano on election day. We had 8 inches of snow just a couple days before that. So it was a snowy day. But a beautiful, beautiful site. And this one, if you can see the asterisk by the name of the place, that means you can visit it. Going back to the one in Barnard, you can visit that one too. It has trails in it. It's private land, but it has trails. This one, you can just park by the side of Route 100, get out of your car, and you don't really even have to go very far before you find some really, really lovely old trees. But on this steep slope in Granville Gulf, there's patches of old growth forest actually all up and down the Gulf probably. And we haven't done a full inventory of them yet, but this is one that Bob discovered last year when he was evaluating this site for the potential of putting a mountain bike trail through this area, and really figured out that that might not be the most appropriate thing. It's a beautiful old forest, and I was really glad to see it. That's me standing by a big old sugar maple. And this is a dead sugar maple, and just the texture of the wood in this tree was so fascinating to me. And you see a lot of that in old forests, interesting texture. Another thing we noticed on this hemlock is just that there are, on old trees, you'll often see the lower branches are quite stout. And this is high up on a ridge, and there's a lot going on up there on this ridge. This is like a harsh place to be, and a lot of wind damage, and so the canopies of the trees are really complex and kind of gnarled. Well, that's Granville Gulf. Let's go now to Addison. Again, jumping around, we're going over to Wilmarth Woods in Addison on the side of Snake Mountain. This is one that you can get to very easily. Just hike up Snake Mountain and you're walking right through this. It's right on both sides of the trail. This beautiful old forest, which has some history of management, but has been unmanaged for a very long time. It's owned by the Nature Conservancy and managed by the Nature Conservancy. So you can see in this photo, you can see big sugar maple, ash, a big grapevine. But there's also young trees. It's not all just old trees. And interestingly, there's shagbark hickory in here, big shagbark hickories. This is our friend Charles Ferree and my husband Bill over here. And when Charles was looking up this tree, he said, "Now, there's some habitat there," was his comment. And it's really true. When you get older trees, the bark is really even more like itself in a way. You know, just like people get more like themselves as they age, trees get more like themselves as they age. And there's the shaggy bark on the shagbark hickory is tremendous habitat for roosting bats in particular. And then there's some downwood. And again, this site unfortunately has a heavy deer population, and heavy deer browse and regeneration is a problem. Now, going just a little further north into Charlotte, this is a site that is owned by the Nature Conservancy, fascinating site that's owned by the Nature Conservancy. It's Williams Woods. You can also visit there. There are trails through it. There's a sign. You can just park there by the side of Greenbush Road in Charlotte and visit this site. And we bring our class there. Kathy Paris and I teach a botany class, and we bring our class there every year. This year, you'll notice Kathy and the students are wearing masks. So we were wearing masks in the woods, but we did go out in person to this beautiful site where the students found this big oak tree that they flagged and wanted to talk about and learn more about. The other thing we do when we go to this site, what we typically do with the class is we say, okay, we're going to just walk for 10 minutes in silence, and we want you to observe what you see. And after that walk, the students say what they've observed. And so here's some things that last year they observed: hemlock, tip-ups, a diverse canopy with several strata. These are the students' words, not mine. Coarse woody debris, pits and mounds, moss, woodpeckers, good snags. Those are the things that the students noticed as we walked through this woods. And on this list was not this feature, which is that the trees are very shallow rooted in this forest because the soil is clay, it's very dense clay. And this is a clay plain forest. And so the trees are pretty shallow rooted. And because of that, the place is really vulnerable to wind throw. The trees are vulnerable to wind throw. This is Lynn McNamara of the Nature Conservancy in a wind, after a wind event, and I'm not sure which one this was, but there have been several over the years that have been documented going back to the 1938 hurricane. And it's always like this. And, you know, anytime there's a wind event, there's something goes on in here. It just creates this amazing, fascinating habitat and diversity. It's beautiful. The other thing that makes this vulnerable is that it is surrounded by agricultural land. So the wind can just get howling up the Champlain Valley. This is Larry Hamilton, who died a few years ago, but was a steward of Williams Woods and loved it and was fascinated by, he was a forest ecologist, retired from Cornell, and he was just fascinated by all the different dynamics going on in this forest. So I really am glad the Nature Conservancy sent me these pictures just this morning. I'm really glad I could show a picture of Larry and his his stewardship of this amazing place. But one of the storms that came through there was Hurricane Floyd in 1999. And after that, I remember visiting the place with Larry and a couple other people. And some of the people that were there said, "Oh my gosh, this is horrible. This is awful. I can't believe this forest has been destroyed." And Larry reassured them, "No, that's hasn't been destroyed. It's just part of what goes on here." So it's a beautiful place. Now going down to Andover, this is a property, and I just have one slide. You can't go to this property. We own it. It's forever wild. You can't get there because it's landlocked. It's surrounded by private land, but it's a beautiful place, and we're talking about possibly making it so that people can go visit there. Now going up to Cambridge, this is the Cambridge Pines Natural Area, which is a fascinating place that I got a tour of it from Sally Laughlin, my colleague recently, who lives adjacent to the forest. And you can see by looking at the tree that Sally's leaning against, and also this tree, that there are branches low down on these pine trees. They're majestic pines, but they were open grown. This is an old field site. It is not an old growth forest. It's majestic, beautiful, and is attaining some old forest characteristics with downwood, fungi, but it's by no means an old growth forest, but it's still worthy of protection. Now here's another odd site. This is going down to Vernon black gum swamps. Black gum is a tree that is, this is an accessible site too in Vernon, Maynard Millertown Forest, is a tree that was left alone because it didn't have much timber value. It's got this fascinating, really furrowed bark, really beautiful bark. And it tends to get hollow with age. Here's a downed tree in this black gum swamp. And if you look closer at this down tree, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Can you see that? And that's, so this would provide beautiful habitat for example, a denning black bear or some other mammal, just really great habitat. And black gum has a really fascinating adaptation to wind, which is that normally, even though you just saw a downed tree, normally the trees don't fall, but the upper branches fall. So the branches will break off before the whole tree falls, which creates this really gnarled looking appearance to the tree's canopy. And there's the leaves of black gum. Black-throated green warbler in that Pennsylvania study was one of the birds that is 3 times more abundant in old growth forests than in younger ones. So I was glad to see it here. Then we've got a couple of old forests that don't look old. Limestone bluff cedar pine forest in Ferrisburg. These trees don't look very old, but they grow very, very slowly on these cliffs and can be very, very old. And then we're going to go over to New Hampshire to the Pisgah Tract of Harvard Forest. And thanks to Harvard for these photos. This was before and after the 1938 hurricane, which blew the tract down, basically. And so there are, the standing trees now are not old trees, but all the older trees are down on the ground. It's still considered an old growth forest. It's just an unusual one in that it doesn't have standing dead trees. Thanks to David Foster for these photos. And then in Rutland, we've got this Pine Hill Park, which has red pine and pitch pine that don't necessarily look old, and maybe they're not old, but the place has been under natural processes for a long time, whether or not the trees are old. And then similarly on Mount Abraham in Green Mountain National Forest, doesn't necessarily look old, but natural processes have been going on here for a very long time. And then if you look at the top of Mount Mansfield, look at this Krumholtz, you know, that's old. Trees aren't old necessarily, stems are not old, that's old. And then we're just going to go to some other places. David, were you going to talk about these other places?
Oh, I think just blast through them.
This is Mendocino in Mendocino County, California. Yep. My 10-year-old son. Redwood. He's 20 now.
Yeah, and I think some of the thing for me is that, you know, goes well beyond Vermont, and that this stuff's being studied all over. And, you know, if anyone's been in any bald cypress, that one's just blew me away seeing that picture.
Yeah.
And this one's out in Chile. Just amazing.
Okay, now we want to transition to just a few final words. that Vermont Conservation Design has a vision for Vermont's future, in which they call for about 9% of Vermont's forest to become old forest over time, to bring this missing component back to Vermont's landscape and offer confidence that species that benefit from old forests can persist. We support Vermont Conservation Design's goal. Similarly, the Woodlands and Wildlands Initiative, which covers all of New England, calls for about 10% of the forest to be what they call wildlands, and 90% woodlands, which means timber producing or product producing forest. So very, very similar. These two visions are very, very similar. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, and so, what are we doing here in Vermont? I mean, at VLT. So, we're close to 500,000 acres under conservation. We have over 2,500 easements that we monitor. And so, again, these easements don't necessarily dictate what to do, but it is protection. So we feel there's an opportunity for us. So we've been educating ourselves. We've been having other workshops for educating others, bringing in different experts to talk, certainly supporting the Vermont Conservation Design goals. We're trying to partner with other folks. I know we currently are partnering with UVM, with Tony D'Amato and Caitlin Littlefield on some studies. And I think something important to me, and with the consulting forester hat on, is developing management guidelines to help consulting foresters and or landowners, who want to look at this and promote old forest characteristics. So it's definitely an ongoing project, and but I think it's hopefully we'll have some of those management guidelines out. And I mean, a lot of that has been done. It's just, I don't know about everyone else, but there's so much information out there, and part of that process is just whittling that down to something that's usable. So, yeah, and that just, again, I get back to that, taking a passive or active approach, and there's lots of different ways to do that. So we're hoping we can influence some of that. And I think.
And I want to just share some resources with you. There's lots of books out there, and pamphlets and articles and in scientific literature on this topic. These are just a few of the things that are out there. This Eastern Old Growth Forest is a classic, not out of date whatsoever, even though it's a few years old now. But there's others. Entangled Life has a chapter about the fungi and the mycorrhizal networks. Then there's these publications, and then over here I've just got like this pile of scientific literature that I've been going through. So there's a lot of information out there, and we're going to share some of that with you. We're going to share a list of resources in a follow-up email. So now we have a little bit of time for a few questions. And I believe that Caitlin will moderate the questions, and David and I will formally end at 2 o'clock, but David and I are more than happy to stay for a while after 2 o'clock to answer other questions as they come up.
Great. Well, thanks, Liz and David, for a great, really informative presentation with some pretty amazing photos. So just wanted to start with a question from Nancy Patch. Hi, Nancy. And Nancy's wondering, is there any comparison between mycorrhizal networks in old forest versus recovered or reestablished forests? How about ecologically managed forests that have been managed with retention and complexity versus more of an even age, simple structure? And how long does it take for a mycorrhizal network to develop? So kind of many questions in there. If you want to tackle one, I can come back and remind you if there were a couple other pieces that Nancy was wondering about.
Yeah, Nancy, this is a new area of research, relatively speaking. I don't think we know that much about it, especially here in the Northeast. As I said, a lot of this research has gone on in the Pacific Northwest, and they're learning things. One of the things they're learning is that when you clear cut a forest, you actually disrupt that mycorrhizal network quite a bit. And but it is the mycorrhizae, it is the fungi that bring the forest back to health, which is really interesting. And there was one study where they they clear cut an area and then tried to replant some trees, and the seedlings just wouldn't grow. But they finally decided to inoculate the soil with soil from a healthy forest with those fungi, and the tree growth increased dramatically. So yeah, you do. It seems like there is some indication that you do some damage to the mycorrhizal network, but it is the thing that's going to heal the forest ultimately. A lot of your questions I don't have the answers to, and it's really fascinating stuff.
Okay, great. And we have a question from Justin Vreeland, who is tuning in from Pennsylvania. So is it possible to have old growth conditions in early successional communities, i.e. is there such a condition as old growth quaking aspen? What if a community was held in a state of suspended young forest conditions through edaphic factors, sort of, was it xeric, or like what, you know, an example would be like woodland barrens?
Yeah, I think that one of the pictures that I showed toward the end, which was that Pine Hill Park in Rutland, which has, you know, which is a xeric site, is a very dry site, and burns sometimes. And so that's there may not be really old trees there, but it's, I don't know if I suspended animation, I don't know if I would use that word, but that might be kind of some of the things you're thinking of. David, how about you? And how about early successional species?
Yeah, I think you're just, yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer. But, you know, certainly any early successional stuff, you're fighting Mother Nature on that. So, you know, maybe if you could, yeah, I don't have a good answer. Sorry.
Okay, great. And folks, if I could just remind you, if you could type questions in the Q&A, it's a little easier for me to track them so I can make sure that we answer them. Thanks. So a question here from John Leibowitz with the Northeast Wilderness Trust. If our landscape was once scraped bare by ice and forests, started anew to become old growth, could one not argue that through permanent protection, old growth could reemerge in our region? Is there a different technical reason for referring to these recovered forests as old forests versus old growth? Thank you both for an awesome presentation. Kudos.
Thanks, John. I'm glad you're here. And yes, we think that protecting some of these places where they exist, or even where they don't exist, in permanent wildland protection would be a really great way to get more of this on our back on our landscape. And so that's something that we fully support, where it works, where it's appropriate, where we can. Can you remind me, Caitlin, the second part of John's question?
Yeah, so is there a different technical reason for referring to these recovered forests as old forests versus old growth?
I'd like to evade that question, John, if you don't mind, because like I said at the beginning, a lot of people have different definitions of old growth. And for some, it's a very pure thing of never having been touched by humans or very minimally touched by humans. For other people, it's really more of a functional thing. You know, does the forest function as an old forest? Does it have those characteristics? Does it have, yeah. You can have an old forest that doesn't have that sort of formal, you know, untouched part of the definition that's really, really highly functional. So the distinction is kind of gray in a way. David, do you have more to say about that?
No, I just, you know, put a plug in for those areas that, you know, we can't, it just wouldn't be appropriate to protect or not possible. You know, are there things we can do? Again, tweaking our silviculture to build in some of these characteristics that could be beneficial in the long run.
Okay, great. And a question from Kimberly, which is, what is your sense of how much burning Native Americans were doing in Vermont? Was that only further south and out west, or were they managing forests with burning this far north?
This is a great question, and there's some debate about this too. We don't think that there was very much of that in Vermont. There was some of it in southern New England, but recent research suggests that it's not anywhere near as extensive as sometimes people think. So again, in the resources, I'll point you to a recent paper that talks about some of that, and but it was fair. We know that it was fairly minimal here in Vermont. If there's anyone else who wants to speak up on that, that would be great. David, what do you have to say about that?
No, it's just what you were going to say.
Great. And if folks do have comments, that want to chime in sort of additional info, you can please enter that in the chat and questions in the Q&A. Great, thank you. So a couple of quick questions. Eric is wondering, is the Chittenden site accessible to the public?
The short answer is it is on public land, but these places don't have easy access. They're mostly remote and in very, very steep terrain with, often in bouldery areas. So yes, it's public land and you can go there, but it's hard to get there and hard to find. So I didn't put those as places you can go and visit.
Okay, great. And I can't remember, Liz, if the Barnard site was that same situation, but someone was wondering what the name of that was. And we'll be, just to remind folks, we will be sharing the list of sites you can visit in our follow-up email.
Yeah, the Barnard site is privately owned with a Vermont Land Trust easement. However, it does have public trails going through it, and you can access it easily from Silver Lake State Park. Just go to Silver Lake State Park. There's a woods road, and you'll see the trails going into the woods, and we'll give you a little more detail on that.
Great. Excellent. Let's see. So Tom is wondering if invasive plants are a problem, or aren't a problem in old growth forests, and why?
Oh, great question. Yeah, great question. The more people I talk to about this, the more I learn that old growth forests really are incredibly resilient. Old forests and old growth forests are incredibly resilient. And I've heard a number of people say, best way to get rid of invasives is just leave the canopy on. Don't do management. And that's something that, that people are watching. There's some research on this, but that there is some evidence that certain invasive species over time will blink out if you leave the forest alone. I think there's some work on garlic mustard that shows that. There's probably other and I anecdotally I've heard buckthorn will retreat over time if you just leave the canopy be. How about David? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's especially in Pennsylvania when I'm toured down there. It's basically, if you better have something figured out if you're going to do any harvesting to deal with invasives. So a lot of times they would leave it, maybe skip a rotation or those kind of things just because of that. So that would factor into what you're saying.
Okay, great. Thanks you both. I want to be mindful of time. And so maybe, Liz, if we could just wrap up with our last slide with a couple links. And then for those that are interested in staying on, it sounds like there's definitely more questions and we could have more discussion. But just wanted to thank you all for coming today. You will get a follow-up email with a list of resources, including places to visit and a short survey. We would love it if you would fill out our survey. It really helps us tailor these programs. We take your feedback to heart. I also want to thank those that have already made a donation. We're a member-based organization, and so definitely appreciate your support. If you haven't made a donation, please consider doing so to help support the protection of all these special places. And finally, we are recording the webinar. And so we will include the link to that. We post it to the Land Trust YouTube video. We'll include that link so you can go back and look at all of the wonderful photos and review all the information. Liz and David, just quick question. Someone was wondering if you would share the slide deck outside of the recording. So that would be another thing that we could include in that follow-up email.
I think we would be happy to do that. Some of these slides were provided by other people. So as long as those other people are credited, if you use the slides, I think that should be fine.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks again, Liz and David. Great presentation, really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us. And for those that, so I will say adieu to those that would like to carry on with their day. And for those that would like to stay and continue the Q&A, please do so.
I'm really excited to talk more. So hear your comments, hear your questions. So we'll be here.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Let's see, let me go back to our.
Hey, Caitlin, can I just interject with one little thing? Because people are asking about sites.
Yeah.
This book is called The Sierra Club Guide to ancient forests of the Northeast. It's really a nice little guide that will lead you to some places that are visitable and easy to get to. They're not all old growth truly, you know, but anyway, it's a nice little book.
Great. Oh, thanks, Liz. That's great.
That'll be in your resources.
Okay, so a quick question here from Catherine, who's wondering how soon those management guidelines that you mentioned, Liz and David, will be put out, do you think? Any sense of a timeline?
Do you have any sense, Liz?
Well, so one answer to that is that
That's true.
one of the resources we showed is a pamphlet that Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro have put together. Had something of a Massachusetts focus. It's a really nice publication. We'll give you a link to that. So that exists, and what we hope to do is to work with Tony and Paul and Caitlin Littlefield to sort of bring that home to Vermont, and we hope to do that in the next year. It's something that we've been talking about. You know, this pandemic sort of changed a lot of things, but anyway, that's our goal.
Good.
What do you think, David?
No, that sounds good. Yeah, I mean, there is stuff out there. It's just we're hoping to sort of bring that all together and making it more user-friendly.
And so you've said it on a recording, both of you. I'm just like flagging that for you. We'll all hold your hands to the fire on that one.
The next 10 years.
Just kidding. Great. So Tina is wondering, is anyone doing research in Vermont on the association of old growth forests and medicinal plants?
I don't know. That's all I can say, Tina. I don't know.
A lot of stuff I've seen is all from down south more. And they typically go for the older forest for certain species, but I don't know about up this way.
I don't know either. One thing I do know is that, you know, old forests, as we've seen, have a lot of fungi in them, and some of those fungi are medicinally valuable, but the details of that I don't know. Sorry.
Great. And I see a couple folks are raising their hands, and so if there's a comment, if you can type it in the chat, that's great. Or if you want to type your question in the Q&A, that's also another great. Oh, and I see, this is neat, from Ali Kosaba, who is with Forest and Park. She shared that an example of an old growth aspen stand is Pando. It's a clonal all-male quaking aspen stand in Colorado that is estimated to be over 10,000 years old. How cool.
I forgot about that.
Ali,
Yeah.
that's great. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Ali. Great. Let's see. So here's a question for you both from Ancient Woodlands. It says, for our new younger students, could you briefly outline the importance of healthy forest carbon pools and how they affect the environment?
Go ahead, David.
Healthy carbon pools. Well, I'm not 100% sure where to go with that, but I guess I would say, you know, with our trying to manage for old forest characteristics, tend to maximize all these pools and sort of create a healthier forest. Something along those lines. Would you agree, Liz?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think any of those things could really lifts it off if you can manage towards those. You know, keeping snags and maybe, you know, building in coarse woody debris, stuff like that would certainly help your sort of holistically help the forest and maximize your carbon stores or stocks.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. And let's see. Okay. Okay, here's from Kathleen Stutzman, a consulting forester. As climate change continues, will it be possible to have forests that meet the standards of old growth forests, as in not having been altered by humans?
Say it again, Caitlin.
Yeah, okay. And I might need, Kathleen, you might need to a little clarity. As climate change continues, will it be possible to have forests that meet the standards of old growth forests, as in not having been altered by humans? So is it possible to actually meet that sort of definition?
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, so forests are going to change because of climate change, and if that is considered a human disturbance, then yeah, I guess they wouldn't still meet that definition. But I see it a little more broadly, and I think that an old growth forest that's an old growth forest now is going to change. It's going to change in ways that we don't know. It might be blown over by a tornado. It might be hit by pests or pathogens. Other things might happen, but I still would consider that an old growth forest. So I think the answer to me is yes. What about you, David?
Yeah, no, I would agree. I was wondering if this is in relation to any of the tax programs like current use or something like that. And that would be a different topic.
I want to say also that you should, Ali Kosiba, who just piped up and had a comment, is Vermont's new climate forester, or the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. She's thinking about all these questions, compiling information, being sort of a hub of information about climate change and adaptation to climate change in forest management, including old forests. So just keep an eye out. She's doing some great stuff and can be a help. Hope you don't mind I said that, Ali.
Great. So a question from Eric. Is there any way to mitigate the productivity of the soils in regard to mycorrhiza when attempting to manage for young forest?
I don't know enough about.
Yeah, I don't think we know enough. I don't think we know enough about this in the Northeast to really give you a good answer to that question. At least I don't. If there's anybody on the call who does have more information on that, please just put a note in the chat box or speak up.
Great, thank you. I will keep an eye on that. And actually, speaking of chat, interesting question from Anne, who said spring flowering ephemerals are far and few between. Is this because most forests have been very disturbed?
Deer
is a big issue. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Can you talk about the forest species shifts, losses that have occurred in the last several hundred years, and how this might create a shifted baseline in what we consider to be old forest?
Yeah. So if I could go back to the previous question first for a second, we do find that older forests have more diversity of herbaceous species and wildflowers. And part of that is that it takes a really long time after clearing for some of these plants to recolonize the forest because they're dispersed by ants. And so older forests tend to have more abundant, but all forests are vulnerable to deer browse. And then as far as a different baseline going forward, again, I think that, David, you want to take that? No. Yeah, I mean, I think we are seeing change, and we will see change, and we're just going to keep learning as we go forward. I don't know if I answered the question. You might want to repeat it, Caitlin.
Sure. So Liz's question was, can you talk about the forest species shifts or losses that have occurred in this past several hundred years? And maybe it's not all losses, but maybe you can consider it shifts. Some losses, some just shifts in composition, and how this might create a shifted baseline in what we consider to be old forest. Is there a specific species composition? I'm assuming Liz is trying to ask about.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a shifting thing, a moving thing, and everything's changing. The climate. This is not the first time the climate has changed, by the way. I mean, over the last the number of years, the thousands of years since deglaciation, there have been very dramatic changes in the climate, and this is an unprecedented one because it's happening so quickly, and it's our fault. But yeah, we have seen shifts. For example, in a period called the Holocene climatic climatic optimum, which some people call the hypsithermal. We had like more oak moving northward, and then that went back southward. So we're going to see things like that happening as the climate changes. And so, yeah, we'll always have, you know, a different baseline, I guess, if you will.
Great, thanks, Liz. And question here from Charlie Cogbill. He says, is VLT monitoring these sites with plots to see how old forests change?
You want to do that for us, Charlie?
Yeah.
We don't have any monitoring going on the sites that we have control over. So I'd love to talk to you about that and see if there are things that we could do. We're not a research organization, but we could partner with, for example, UVM or the Forest Parks and Recreation Department to do some monitoring. And I'd love to just chat with you more about that. Thanks a lot for the question. And thanks, Charlie, for your all your knowledge and wisdom and so forth on this.
Great. And then Tina's wondering, do we have an example of a forever wild easement for property owners interested in this protection tool? And I don't know too if John Leibowitz is still on with us, but that would be a good contact as well, Tina. Liz, do you want to?
Yeah, we don't, at the Vermont Land Trust, we don't have very many forever wild easements, and they've been sort of, you know, kind of not a goal of ours, particularly over the years. So some people at Harvard Forest, led by David Foster, are working right now to assess wildlands in New England, and also they're collecting various wildland easements, templates, and trying to find out, you know, how different people do it in different places. So there are lots of ideas about out there, different templates. If you want to get in touch with me personally, by the way, Liz at vlt.org, David at vlt.org are our emails, so that we're really easy to find. You know, I might be able to direct you to something, but I would say that we don't have a really, what I would say is a good template for that right now. But maybe John Leibowitz does, of the Northeast Wilderness Trust.
Great, Liz.
Just one more thing. What we do have, however, is we do, in our normal working lands conservation easements, we often set aside certain places. It might be an acre, it might be 80 acres, it might be a few hundred acres as ecological protection zones. Which would be hands-off because they have special features. And so we do have language, template language for that.
Great, thanks, Liz. So a couple of questions here related to Vermont conservation design. So one was asking about, you know, could you maybe go over some background? So maybe I'll break it down to a couple of different questions. The first one, I think, would be helpful to have a sense of where that 9% target came from, 9 to 10% target came from. Because one person is wondering, God, given their biodiversity, resilience, and ability to store carbon, is 9 to 10%, is that enough? And so maybe a little background on that, Liz, and then I can ask the other couple questions on that.
Well, I'll say a little bit about that, but then I'll go to David, because I think he can really speak to the balance of wildlands and managed forest land and why we need that balance. So it is, frankly, it's a practical decision in a sense, based on the fact that, sure, it was 95% old growth at one time, or old forest, or, you know, something like that. And we can't go back to that because we live here now. There's a lot of us living here now. And so we're just looking for a practical, you know, what could we achieve that's better than where we're at right now? And would give us some of that resiliency over time. And so it was really a balance, the decision to come up with 9 or 10%, in the case of wildlands and woodlands, a balance of the science and our other human needs. David, can you elaborate?
Yeah, well, you kind of sort of hit on what I was going to say. I think it is that, I don't know, it just gets very political very quickly, I guess. You know, we have our whole forest products economy and everything, and it's just trying to find compromise within all that is, it's just very difficult. I wasn't part of any of the conservation design stuff, so I don't know sort of where some of the stressors were But yeah.
David, would you talk about the concept of leakage?
5 minutes or less, yeah. Well, this term leakage comes up a lot with the carbon work because, you know, the idea is if you're backing off in one area, you're going to have to make it up somewhere else. And so this is a really tough, at least for me personally, a really tough one to wrap around. You know, so if we do end up, say, protecting all of the forests in Vermont, you know, what happens to the surrounding forests? And I'm definitely glossing over this, but it's a big topic, and a lot of people, a lot of very thoughtful, well-meaning people are thinking about it. For some folks, it's very cut and dry. So it's a big deal. And I think with the carbon offset market and everything, it's something that's constantly being looked at. So I don't know if there's any more you want to add, Liz.
I'm just referring to another paper, a paper that came out a number of years ago called The Illusion of Preservation, which basically makes the case, it's about this topic, makes the case that if you, say if in New England we were to protect all the forests and not have any timber products coming from our forests, we're basically creating, like you said, David, a minute ago, creating a problem somewhere else. Because we use timber products, we use paper, we use Amazon boxes, all that stuff.
Firewood.
Yeah. Great.
And thanks, Liz and David. I know you kind of addressed this a little bit, but Zach was just wondering does VLT have a strategy in place to be part of reaching the 9% target in Vermont conservation design? Or, you know, your thoughts on how we as a state can encourage more forever wild management through fee ownership, conservation, or easements?
Yeah, I mean, we are trying to do our part to be part of this, and our part is a fairly small part because we don't specialize in forever wild easements. But we've been talking with other organizations who do that, and looking for ways to partner, looking for ways to identify places that make sense to add to that goal, and to work with others to help get there. We don't have a specific strategy, and the state doesn't have a specific strategy, as you probably know, Zach. But we're working. A lot of us are talking to each other and trying to figure out ways to get to that goal. As far as the state is concerned, one of the ways is they're working on some large management plan. For example, the Worcester Range right now is under, as you know, under investigation, or they're looking at the long range management plan. So some of that might be converted to set aside for old forest. Don't know, but yeah, we're all trying to get there, and we're not there yet. We're actually a sort of back of the envelope calculation is that Bob Zano of Fish and Wildlife has done, is that we might be almost halfway there, but not all of the places that count in that halfway there are permanently protected. So we're trying to look at places that and add permanent protection to places that could use it.
Great. So question about deer and other animal species. So to follow up from Jennifer, to follow up on this idea of loss of species and changing communities over time, deer are overabundant because their predators, catamounts and wolves, are extirpated from the region. As you've said, the overabundance of deer affects plant communities. Are there other missing or overabundant animal species that might be affecting the overall health of old forests?
Anything come to mind?
No, I can't think of anything specifically. I mean, those apex predators are a major piece of what's missing. Maybe someday we'll get those back, who knows? But I don't know of other species that are missing, or others that are so problematic as deer.
And Justin sort of typed in the chat box, wolverine, woodland bison, and woodland caribou. not familiar with any of those species. I don't know if they would have been in the Northeast, Liz or David. Do you have any comments on those?
Yeah, way in the past. Yeah, but I don't know much about those species.
All right. Great. And then the one sort of follow-up question about Vermont conservation design from Eleanor was, so the question is Vermont conservation design ready to consult landowners on managing for old forest? And I'm wondering, Eleanor, if you mean, is there a technical guide for landowners to doing that? Liz, maybe you understand Eleanor's question.
I'm not sure what Eleanor means, but there, there are, as we said, we're going to be working on some stuff ourselves at Vermont Land Trust, and to help people get some of those old forest characteristics. But the Vermont conservation design is not specifically, that's not what they do. The Vermont conservation design is a vision it had an endpoint. It was a research effort that has put out a report, but they're not. So, but now, as I said, Ali Kosiba, who's the climate forester at Forest Parks and Recreation, one of her jobs, I believe, is to provide outreach and education and help people think about some of this stuff. But whether she's specifically going to work on old forests, I don't know. David, have anything?
No.
Great. So a question here from Alan Clark was wondering, do very old trees like open grown sugar maples and along ancient roads, do they count? Like, are they important?
Hi, Alan. Yeah, they're definitely important. Those trees, whether they're open grown or not, can provide a lot of the habitat values, right, David? Why don't you talk about it?
Well, it's kind of a loaded question because I think in my town, yes, from my perspective, they're very important, but to the guys plowing the road, they're not important and they're in the way. So I think with the roadside trees, it gets away from ecology. But if you want to talk about ecology, yeah, they're just as important as the other trees. And they typically do. I was just going to comment on that. Typically you see the woodpeckers, and I've seen a pileated woodpecker working one near my house. Species I typically see in the woods, but they're working along those. So, but when it conflicts with plowing and roads and stuff like that, it becomes a whole different issue.
Great, thank you. And then just a quick follow-up from Zach on the question of species and then leakage. So Zach says, thanks Liz and David for a great presentation. I'd add beavers to the list of species that are still far too few in our region. They have a profound positive impact on forest health and diversity. Wolves have been found in Maine just recently and used to help keep game species in check, along with catamounts, cougars. RE leakage, just so everyone knows, only 2 to 3% of Vermont is today in forever wild management, with a guarantee that it will someday become old forest. So on balance, it would seem that we are a long, long way from a situation where we have protected so much forest that we could have any significant impact on timber supply in the state or region. So
great, thanks for all that, Zach, all that clarification. And that was really exciting news that you shared recently about wolves being found in northern Maine. That's pretty cool, pretty exciting.
Great.
And beaver are keystones. It's a keystone species. They're just create so much habitat diversity and flood resilience and all kinds of stuff. And thanks for mentioning that.
Great. Well, thanks, Liz and David. We still do have some more questions, but we're about a half an hour post, so we'll probably just wrap up. And I would just encourage folks to email Liz and David with more follow-up questions or ideas or comments as they come. As I said, we're going to send a survey, so we'd appreciate if you would share your feedback and ideas. We'll send a resource list, send a list of sites that you can visit. Just as Liz and David have sort of said at the beginning, this is a learning journey. So we definitely appreciate the discussion and questions and look forward to learning more together as we go along. So Liz and David, any sort of final comments or thoughts before we?
Thank you everyone for coming. This has been fun.
Yep, thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.